study culture and negotiation strategy, and trust is a very important concept for researchers like me. We define trust pretty much the way people in other disciplines define trust, with an emphasis on benevolence and integrity. What we find is that negotiators who trust use strategy in a way that allows them to negotiate high-quality agreements. What they do is they share a little information about their own interests and priorities, and they ask for information from their counterpart about their counterpart's interests and priorities. Now, an interest in negotiation, that concept, refers to the reason underlying why negotiators are asking for what they want. So it's the reason why you're asking for what you're asking. Why do you want that? It answers the why question. Priorities refer to what issues are more important and what issues are less important. So negotiators who trust and share information about interests and priorities, learn about the interests and priorities of their counterpart, are able to trade things off and create high-quality agreements. But of course, to do that, you have to make yourself a little vulnerable because you're sharing information that the other party could take advantage of. So a key question in my research is who trusts and why? And one answer to that question is culture. I'd like you to take a look at the chart that plots World Value Survey trust data by regions of the world. Their trust question is, most people can be trusted? Yes or no? And so what you see in the chart is the percentage averaged by nation of people who say we can trust other people. So if we take a look at the data, you might infer from seeing that trust is relatively high in the West and in East Asia, and relatively low in South Asia and in the Middle East and in Latin America, that East Asians and Westerners are going to be using a lot of strategy that shares information, and people in Latin America and in the Middle East and South Asia aren't. And you'd only be half right. So it turns out that the research on negotiation in the West shows a lot of information sharing, a lot of cooperative behavior, but we don't see the same thing in East Asia. And the question again is why? It turns out in the West, negotiators seem to use something that we call swift trust. And the idea of swift trust was coined by some researchers, Meyerson, Weick, and Kramer, and they were studying film crews. They looked at film crews and they said, these are people who come together to do a highly interdependent job. They frequently don't know each other, maybe by reputation, but they haven't worked together in the past. But they come together and they coalesce very rapidly and they are very cooperative. And why does that happen? These researchers asked. And they said, it happens because they assume the other's a professional. They assume that the other's trustworthy. And as soon as you signal that you think someone else is trustworthy, that has 2 or 3 implications. One is, they would have to be a cad not to follow up and step up to your expectations of trust. But the other is you're signaling something about yourself, that you're willing to make yourself vulnerable to the other party and believe that they are trustworthy. In negotiation research, we see very much the same thing in our North American and Northern European data. Negotiators come to the table and make the assumption that the counterpart is trustworthy. And they then go in and ask questions, get a little information about those very important interests and priorities, offer a little information in return, and in that point-counterpoint, they begin to justify the assumption of trust that they made in the first place, and they begin to solidify that trust because they have behavior that they see of the other party. So let's take a look at the data from East Asia. Consistently in study after study, we find East Asians are extremely competitive in negotiation. And this, of course, is not what we would expect looking at the trust data. A really good answer was given by Toshio Yamagishi, a Japanese psychologist. He was studying social dilemmas. Now, a social dilemma is a multi-party prisoner's dilemma. It's a commons problem in economics. So the tension in a social dilemma is that if all the parties cooperate, everyone shares a larger piece of the pie, larger set of resources. If, however, everyone competes, they share a smaller set of resources. And what Yamagishi found is that his Japanese students in a social dilemma situation would cooperate as long as there were sanctions for failure to cooperate or competition. And what he described in Japanese society is a society that's very tightly controlled by social norms, by social monitoring, and by social sanctioning. Michelle Gelfand studies a concept that she calls cultural tightness, cultural looseness. And it's very similar to the way Yamagishi described Japanese culture versus American culture. So a tight culture, according to Michelle Gelfand, is one where there are strong social norms, there is monitoring of social norms, there is sanctioning of failure to conform to social norms. So Michelle Gelfand and her colleagues all around the world collected cultural tightness, looseness data from participants. These were mostly teachers and university students. They asked a series of questions about how culture operated and how tight those norms were, how much sanctioning and monitoring was going on. And so you see in this chart how those same countries fall out on cultural tightness, looseness. These are all the same nations that we show in the trust scale. And what do you see? We see that Western culture is a loose culture. That's no surprise. East Asian culture is a tight culture. That's no surprise. The Middle East and South Asia are also a tight culture, but those interesting Latin Americans are a loose culture. And so my colleagues and I think that there's more to culture and negotiation strategy than just trust. It's that interface between trust and cultural tightness, looseness that accounts for how negotiators in different parts of the world use strategy.